All right, let's get started. So for today's CCI colloquium, we're very happy to have Renée Hlozek from the University of Toronto, the Dunlap Institute for Astronomy and Astrophysics at the University of Toronto. Renée received her doctorate from the University of Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar in 2011. And she was a Spitzer Fellow in Princeton, and now she's in Toronto. Renée told us yesterday that she has 4 halves of her research. So she works on the cosmic microwave background as part of the ACT and Simon's Observatory collaborations. She works on large scale structure via Rubin and LSST, on ultralight axions and how they can affect cosmological observables. And as we'll hear about today, she also works on applying some of her methods to neuroscience. Personal anecdote was that I started working on very light scalar field dark matter in 2014, 2015. And I had this question, how much dark matter can there be in such ultralight particles? And I didn't know if it was out in literature. And right around that time, Renée posted one of her papers on this topic and actually gave me the right answer. And I checked back, and since 2015, that paper has had more citations per year, every year, counting. So Renée started working on light axions before it was cool, with the definition of cool in this room. So yeah, so she started thinking about things before they were fashionable, and she will tell us about something new and interesting today. So take it away, Renée.
Thank you so much. Great. Oh, now you can hear me. Great. Thank you so much. So what a nice introduction. I have not checked that paper, but now I will do because I'm vain. But I must say, if you want the epitome of cool, so Luca Mandela wrote about these axions in 2008, and not enough people cite Luca Mandela. So thank you, Luca, and thank you very much. So I'm about to turn 40, which means I get to tell you about how to live a long and happy life in academia. And there are 2 things that I can guarantee you should do. You should have weird titles that people are confused about, including like, zippy things. And then you have to have a logo for your research group. So we are called the H-Naughts. It's okay, you can laugh. So I didn't want to name a group after myself because I just didn't know how to have people say my name repeatedly forever because it's really hard. And so, yeah, we're the H-Naughts. And even though I'm going to be talking to you about stuff that maybe some folks don't know me for a little bit, which is just thinking about what we can do with Rubin and transient analysis with Rubin, and then also in the brain, I do want to say if you haven't been checking the archive recently, I have 2 of the H-Naughts members who put out cool papers who are also on the job market. So we had a paper by Harrison on extreme axions and how we can model them within our standard kind of fluid approaches. And then also with an acronym, because I love acronyms, you'll see in this talk there are lots of acronyms that are not always very good ones. But looking at kind of estimates of weak lensing on very small scales to help us, again, learn about weird dark matter models, etc. Okay, so the other thing is what I love is when people, when they're talking about something, they give me a bit of an overview. And so I was thinking, going to a symposium recently, like, okay, what do we use machine learning for in astronomy, right? There are tons of amazing papers that a lot of people in this room are working on and have published. But it's interesting to think, like, what are we actually doing if we categorize it? Because everything you can lump into categories. And I think in my head, we use it for kind of detection, classification or clustering, and then some inference-based learning. Great. And this, of course, is a picture of the classification bit from kind of Galaxy Zoo. And one of the reasons why I think a lot of us do get excited about machine learning techniques is that we can use it in particularly a large data regime. And that large data regime is going to come to us from surveys like the Vera Rubin Observatory. Now, I use the following figure that I'm about to show you a lot, and nobody understands how meaningful it is to me if they didn't live in New York City. And I lived near New York City in 2012 when Hurricane Sandy knocked out the lights of lower Manhattan. And so this is a photographer, Jared Lee, took this photo, and I just love it because you never see New York dark, right? And I use this also because we all talk about standard candles, and like anyone over the age of 10 really doesn't think of candles at all, let alone in how standard they are. But most of us have seen a car. and a headlamp. And in fact, you know, the same argument for standardizable candles. The reason why you have your car standardized, the headlamp standardized, is so that you can do the same inverse distance calibration of a car than that you would with a candle if we lived in the past. However, even this has now got to fail as an example because the new LED headlamps defy all characterization of distance because they just blind you from anywhere they are. So I need to revise this talk. But, you know, the main premise of this work with transient analysis for me is that we want to use type 1a supernovae as a probe of distance and in a way that is new, somewhat new. You know, the Nobel Prize was awarded in 2011. There are tons of folks who work in this field. But what we don't often think about is the field of view over which they have computed their supernova samples. And they're largely, or they have been largely, smaller areas of the sky that people go deep. So if you actually think of an example of, say, the Supernova Legacy Survey, small patch of sky, very deep, amazing cosmology constraints, but really not taking full advantage of the amazing sky. You got to come close, Hog. You got to bring it in. Yeah, there's a chair right here. That's how I know. So I have to tell one more joke. So I was at Oxford. Joe Silk, who's a pioneer of CMB analysis, was at Oxford. We had a teeny tiny little room with chairs at the back. And so if you came late, you had to lift up a chair, and he kept breaking the beam of the projector. Like the chair kept on going through. And, you know, it was quite difficult. And I said to the room, I was like, don't worry, that's just silk damping. And everyone laughed except Joe Silk. He just dead-eyed me. He was just like, so whoops, that's like the only physics joke I have or ever will make successfully. Okay. So the thing about Rubin is that it's going to change our understanding of the sky because it's just truly going to light up. So this is a simulation by Andy Connolly of the kinds of transients that we're going to see with Rubin. So Rubin will detect 1 million sources in the sky, and 10,000 of those will be new objects every night. So if you think that the total number of supernovae to date is about 10,000 forever, and we're going to get not 10,000 type 1a supernovae, but 10,000 sources per night. So the volume is just going to be astronomical. Why is that? Of course, well, it's because of the field of view. So this is, oh, it's a little bit grainy. This is moonlight on the Rubin Observatory. I don't know why they made it look like a duck, but I'm here for it. It's cool. And so the very large field of view means that the survey will scan the sky, you know, every few days. And that is revolutionary if you care about things that change, because you're going to get that snapshot pretty regularly. The other thing that's cool about Rubin is that it has this giant 3,200 megapixel camera. Now, previously, they needed to get a man in a suit because that's who stands next to our telescopes. So this is a man in a suit showing you how big it is. I was recently at SLAC, and now it's 6 people in a suit, but different, a slightly more realistic suit. And I have to just play you this video that I took. It's kind of grainy, but we were on a tour of the facilities, and they're testing the filters at the time. And this was unscripted. But as we were talking, Aaron Rudin was explaining something that, oh, you can't actually hear. The filter comes down. And we're all like, it's amazing. Like, it really is the size of a car. Like, it's very hard to describe just how emotional it is to see this incredibly engineered thing. And they were testing how fast the filters can change, because that, you know, sets how you do cadence studies, etc. And that's just the camera, right? That's just the camera. Yeah, exactly. Okay, we don't need any more. It's amazing the entrance temperature of the camera is so large. Right. And squat. And yeah, it's actually, you can't really see how deep it is, but yeah, it's pretty great. I asked if I could go to the site to be useful. And Chris Walter, my colleague from Duke, he said, those are 2 separate questions. And the answer to both of them is like, no. So, but at some point when people can no longer break things, I will go. And so this, for a while now, up until recently, I should say, not anymore, I was part of the Rubin team trying to figure out what is the best survey cadence, because it turns out if you want to find supernovae, you might think, okay, I'll do the whole sky every 3 days, but that's not great if you want to do a supernova that changes, or transient that changes more rapidly, for example. It's also not necessarily great if you think about, I actually want to get color information, so then how do I change my filters? Turns out if you take a piece of the sky and you do it in higher cadence and then you rotate that piece every 6 months, then you do a little bit better. But if you do that and you don't do it carefully, then you actually mess up the uniformity of the sky for the people who don't care about transients, this kind of static science group. And so we've been working, also if you care about the galactic plane, you want to do a different cadence. If you care about, different air mass studies. And so we've been working with across all the science collaborations to figure out what is the best survey cadence for Rubin. And this is the current, as of November the 1st, this is the current baseline survey after, this is sort of co-added depth after 10 years. And if you care about dark energy, which I'm sure all of you do, there's a ton of science that's going to happen. So this is the wide field, so wide, fast, deep, which will do a bunch of different science cases, including weak lensing and sort of supernovae in the wide field. And then there'll be smaller fields that are those pencil beams deep, able to characterize photometric redshifts, able to do a gold sample of supernovae, etc. Okay, so what does this mean? If you care about cosmology with type 1a supernovae, what does that actually mean in terms of our ability to constrain, say, dark energy? So this is a compilation made by Dan Skolnick and the PanSTARRS team. So PanSTARRS was more of a wide area survey when I was telling you in the beginning about these pencil beam surveys. That has been changing for a while. It's not like Rubin is the first one to do a wide survey. But this is the sort of compilation of all the supernovae to date. And you'll see that there is some scatter, but if you bend down these supernovae, you get pretty good residuals from a model. So in this case, like observation minus lambda CDM, and you get the scatter, which is great. So Rubin's LSST, the large survey of space and time, the legacy survey of space and time, will give us around 400,000 type 1a supernovae. So what does that do? Well, if you actually predict what your Hubble residuals will look like, if you go back here, this scale is in magnitude, so about half a magnitude. This scale is in millimagnitude. So these two models are models that are currently allowed within the error bars for dark energy. And these are my forecast error bars for the year 10 cosmology sample. So, this is why it's going to be transformative, because your wiggle room is gone. If you sort of want to put that a different way, if you combine all the different probes, some of which have different degeneracies, you go from year 1 analysis, which is cool, plus priors from other surveys, to teeny tiny W0 WA parameter space. Now, a tiny bit of side eye against W0 WA. The Chevalier, Pulaski, and Linda, all of you, great, love you, 3 people, amazing. But this is a terrible parameterization if you really care about dark energy at any other time other than today. So a note to simulators everywhere, let's open ourselves up and think about other ways to express parameters. But if you're trying to compare all experiments to each other, this is the hammer and this is the nail that we use. Okay, so, but this assumes a lot. So in coming to this set of supernovae, I made a lot of assumptions in my simulation. So we simulated according to the cadence, we applied some cuts. I magically assumed that I knew that every one of those 400,000 was indeed a type 1a supernova, which is definitely not going to be possible. Even if you do it with a subset and you say, okay, well, there's only a couple of 100,000 and I can get registers for all of them, that's tricky. And so it's worth thinking, how do we actually find them in the first place? Because again, whenever we see pictures of a supernova, it's like that Hubble disk with the dusty disk with this beautiful supernova on the side, and it's super romantic. Meanwhile, in reality, it's this, right? It's some fuzzy picture of a couple of blobs that you don't know really what they are. The key thing is that, of course, you're taking this in multiple filters, and different transients do different things as a function of time in different filters. And you use this to distinguish between them. So most people who work in transient lands of transients, whether they care about AGN, type 1a supernovae, core collapse supernovae, they mostly care about their science, as we all do, focus on their science. The problem is the sky really doesn't care. The sky gives you everything, everywhere, all at once. Hey, that was only intentional after the first phrase. Okay, so you might say, if I just give you hundreds of thousands of transients in the sky, how do you tell them apart? And you can either do some sort of template fitting, you think you know, some Gaussian fit, you think you know there's some parameters, some template, maybe you only want to model the physics, maybe you want to just cluster in feature space. All of these options are fine, but one of the things that you want to do is test people. So we did this a couple of years ago. I'll go super quickly over this, but we started off before the DES analysis. Folks did this kind of tests with just a couple of types of supernovae to see if they could get cosmology from that. We wanted to make things even more extreme and build a giant sample of a ton of different objects, some of which we didn't tell you what they were, or we didn't tell you historically that they could have come from a certain model. And we called this the Photometric LSST Astronomical Time Series Classification Challenge, or PLAsTiCC. Okay. PLAsTiCC was great because it actually was a challenge that galvanized the community beyond just astronomers. So we had thousands of people in it from ML backgrounds, and we basically said, we give you light curves after 10 years, classify them, have at it. And it was super great. We figured out ways we could try and tell how good you were at classification. So can we actually build in our system to evaluate performance across different groups? Which seems to match pretty well what people actually submitted. So the challenge completed a couple of years ago now. One of the things that we did was in our review paper, or our summary paper of the results, instead of just saying this is how people did and this was their performance, we were actually hoping that we would learn something about what is the Uber method to use, or what is there a thing we're going to do for Rubin forever? Spoiler alert, there isn't. Because no one agrees on one way to do anything. Whereas scientists, I don't know why I'd thought that would be the case. But I think it's useful to think through, like, what did we learn from the challenge, and how can that inform us as we go about these future, when the data arrives, basically. So what did we learn from PLAsTiCC? The first thing we learned, and perhaps this is not a surprise to anyone in the room, but your ability to do data augmentation completely changes your ability to do science. So what do I mean by data augmentation? We, in the PLAsTiCC survey, we said, let me give you a sample similar to what we would have when Rubin starts. So about 10,000 supernovae, pretty well sampled from the dark energy survey, and then a low redshift sample. And some people had a bunch of models, some people didn't, some people just did it completely non-parametrically. And then we said, train on that data. And then we provided you with 3 million targets, which is the kind of thing we might expect after N years of Rubin. And if you just naively did that, you would have such an unbalanced training set, both in the total volume of objects that you have, or the total number of objects, but also the relative ratios of types, right? There were some where you had 2 or 3 kilonovae in the sample, and you had to try and classify them.
Yeah, in fact, when you showed the original data sets, they were very different balance, right? Very
different, yeah. And we kind of did that intentionally. I should also say, in our evaluation, we also changed the weights, so you couldn't just win if you only classified type 1As correctly. Yeah, I'll get to the unknown types, but we didn't want to be prescriptive about whose models were included. So you could have a really cool microlensing model that hasn't really been observed, but we allowed that, and we took some of these weird models and then put them in the test sample, but not in the training sample as well. So there was and we just asked people to say, can you tell us if you've never seen this before? The answer is mainly no, they cannot. But that's because we didn't make them try hard enough.
This design is a nice design because it forces people to confront the balance issues.
Exactly, and the reason why we did this, so the first challenge, I was a participant, and my complaint was like, it's not fair, because if we cut the data that we were testing on to look like the training data, we do great. And so I was like, make it more representative. And then I got to do it myself, and power corrupts, absolutely. I was like, no, we'll make it much, much worse. Because if I had to struggle, you have to struggle. No. So it was great. So the winner of the challenge, I should say, the winner was a graduate student who was applying for jobs and figured that was less stressful than applying for jobs. And so Kyle Boone won, although the other two, so the top 3 were not astronomers. But one of the things that I think, one of the reasons why he did well is because he understood data augmentation. And so you can either do this in the data space, so you can take data points and throw them away, or increase the error bars, for example, or redshift your object, or you can do it in feature space and just like add more features so that you can train in that way. And that made a huge impact on your ability to classify correctly. The other thing that we learned is that most of the time people made hundreds of different models and like played them against each other. So we had some combination. We asked people like, what did they do? Did they do class imbalance? So like relative numbers? Did they do just total amount? What did they do with the other class? Did they do an ensemble of different methods? How did they fit the light curves? As again, not surprising, the biggest time sink had nothing to do with the ML. It was all to do with the feature selection. So the Gaussian process fitting slowed down most people, or other kinds of fitting. The other thing that we learned is that most people did some kind of Frankensteinian thing where they added a bunch of different approaches, and then they made them play against each other, and then they combined all the output and they got some answer. Also, I love the names. So we kept everyone's names as much as possible. Go Spartans was my favorite. And people outside of astronomy were way more comfortable with that. So if you don't know Kaggle challenges, there are a couple of things that I think really we should use in astronomy. The first is that people competing on the same stuff had a discussion board that they shared code, they engaged with each other. It's really quite amazing. And every time they shared code, everyone got better, even though they knew they were competing against each other, which is really cool. They also combined forces near the end. They were like, let's do, this is our model. They talked about what they were doing. And there was a public and a private leaderboard. So you could submit your answer for the classifications a number of times every day. That number got more of an issue later, closer to the end, because then you can't just, MCMC your algorithm. You only have a few choices. But what that meant was that people, they were sort of seeing their performance and adjusting, but they were only being tested on a third of the data. There was a private leaderboard that only we could see, and that was pretty nerve-wracking because there was like a switch in who won right at the end. Anyway, it's very sad. But so that was very interesting, and I think when we think about challenges, that's less useful in astronomy because we maybe aren't like watching the answer, or maybe we are, and someone knows the answer and they're not telling me. And so the final thing is related to that. Like we included this anomaly detection element, and it was completely underutilized because people could see how they were doing. What they did with the anomaly is they just sort of took 3 of their top probabilities and kind of averaged them to give the other class a number. It was just completely not related to the actual output. And you can see this when you compare. So these are violin plots, but I've never played a violin. I'm pretty sure they don't look like this. I would call them like needles or something. And here, so this is for all the objects that really were a weirdo. This is the probability that they were given of any one of these classes. And so you would expect your other probability to be non-zero, which is great. But you'll notice that for some of the top 3, they just were combining a number of probabilities. And so therefore there was a large probability that's like the type 2s actually were classified as other when they shouldn't have been. In an ideal world, these are all 0, and that is has a non-zero boundary. Also, just a reminder, when we talk about fitting data, like these are the data we're talking about. It's hard. And there are lots of different things that can look similar. Okay, so PLAsTiCC was very successful. We enjoyed working with a bunch of teams, but then we thought to ourselves, well, how do we need to actually make this more realistic? Because what we showed here was light curves over a long number of days, but really what we care about is the first couple of days, right? Or the first few minutes, and can we actually do this live? And no one is getting a light curve from Rubin. They're getting an alert. They're getting a little beep that something cool is in the sky. They're getting a tiny bit of information, maybe about some of the galaxies nearby or some of the things nearby. Maybe they're getting a postage stamp. Maybe they're getting some information about potential host, and they have to do it. And so the next challenge that, so I was the PI of PLAsTiCC. Gautam Narayan at Illinois is the PI of the extended LSST Astronomical Time Series Classification Challenge, or ELAsTiCC. Sorry, guys. So this is slightly different in the sense now it's not an open challenge to everyone in the public. We're working explicitly with Rubin brokers, particularly 4 of them, and we're testing also how fast they can do the classifications and how they can handle the data that we send to them in this alert format. We're also learning about how to give and receive classifications in a meaningful way. We also changed some things about the model. So to all the students in the audience, the number one thing you can do if you want your advisor to give you feedback is to do something wrong, and they will always want to correct you. like a little bit wrong, not a lot wrong. But and so what we did is we took a bunch of models. We asked people for models. A lot of people didn't give us models. And then we made models, and then they wanted to correct the incorrect models that we had done. And so we had a lot of people say, oh, your transient model is incorrect. Let's make a revision. So that was useful. And so we've extended PLAsTiCC, or we've changed it by making some of our galactic models more realistic, by changing the hosts. So now instead of just randomly putting these transients on the sky, we're actually taking a simulation, trying to put them in galaxies, because we know that there are correlations between the host galaxy and the type of transient. And we're doing that to give ourselves more realistic redshifts. We're doing that using a bunch of different amazing students and their code and their work. So GHOST is looking at translating observed properties of actual transient hosted galaxies and mapping them onto simulations. PZ-Flow is this, allows us to handle discontinuities or discrepancies in the way the galaxies are simulated. So we have smooth distributions. And then we also allow to really have probabilistic weight maps so that we get a better sense of making sure that the rates are all well modeled. And so we went from these kind of data, beautiful light curves, and given to you all at once for 10 years, to a number of streamed alerts. So this is run by Gautam, and Rob Knopp is doing a lot of the heavy lifting in this. And so just this is what this is. So this is number of alerts streamed. This was just last week, or actually last day. So 2.5 million alerts just generated. And I think it's safe to say it's really like this. We thought we would have a little play in the Giza, and it's really fun. It's a lot. Initially we just found so we're running this on NERSC, and we're working with the brokers. And initially it was just like, oh, we can't keep up with the stream. We just cannot handle it. What do we do? Oh, it's just going to keep playing. Okay. We also want to evaluate the performance of the classifiers as a function of time. So this is delta T, and obviously you get better with time, but we want to give the brokers, so it's a little bit an old example, but they're doing like classification of 50 to 60%. Of course, we want to do much, much better than that. But this is how we test them, is basically allow them to do this kind of iteration. And interestingly enough, we're also starting to test about our input output as well, because there are different ways that you can stream these alerts. You can use like an open source kind of Kafka type infrastructure. You can also use more like a Google architecture where it's more bespoke and you have to pay for. And so these plots are showing the time it takes in sort of delta T in terms of seconds for them to ingest our alert as a function of all alerts. Time taken to figure out what it is, so to do their own classification, and then time to send it back to us and for us to inject it. So the TOM is the target and observation manager. And interestingly enough, when we first started running this, it was like, oh, why is it taking some of them 6 seconds? Why do they not understand the input? Why is it taking too long to send it back to us? And we're learning a lot as we do this iteratively to figure out, are we actually ready not just to absorb a stream, but to do stuff with it and then send it back? And so similarly, we can also start to examine, is there a delay in getting the data back to us related to their input-output structures, which I had not anticipated because I'm not good enough at data at I/O to realize this. So this is Rob's fake broker, which is not classifying, it's just randomly assigning numbers. But you see, these are the kinds of comparisons we can run compared to real observations. And so this is ongoing work. We're working with the brokers. They're not winning or losing this challenge. But at the same time, we also can say, can we get answers back that are meaningful? Can we provide classifications to, or classification taxonomies to users that are also useful too? Because if you really care about a galactic transient, you don't care about the difference between type 1a supernova and a 1ax. You just want to know, is it galactic or extragalactic? Give me the data and I'll go do my science with it. And so we want to be able to give you those options hierarchically rather than have you get everything right. Okay, so what? So now we have these data. These are all simulations, but how do we actually go to cosmology? So again, all of the stuff you've seen previously are these beautiful light curves, everything's fit, and that's great, but you might ask yourself, well, are we ready to actually do this? Some of my role within the Dark Energy Science Collaboration is the very exciting and quite traumatic making sure the pipelines are ready and working with people to make sure the pipelines are ready, because there's just a huge gap, especially as a theorist. There's like this big gap between data and theory that you don't think about until you get really dirty in it. So these are the Cosmo DC2 simulations. These are image simulations. They're now inside the Rubin Science portal, but really, really cool set of simulations over a few hundred square degrees. And an awesome postdoc now, who was at Duke, decided to take on this challenge with a tiny patch of the sky, so like 15 square degrees, to actually take these images. So this is the difference image pipeline, which is great. So you have to calibrate your image, you have to do the difference image analysis. If you see something, you do forced photometry, so you go back and look in the past, what was there before. You want to make sure, is it the first time you've seen something? Is it the second observation at the same place, in which now it's gone from just being a source to being like an object that we care about? And then can we do the cosmology? Can we do cuts? Can we fit for cosmology, understand biases, understand our efficiencies? And it's a lot. It's a lot. Bruno did an amazing bit of work, which is also start to look at, so these are simulated observations, and so we kind of know what the truth is, which is helpful, at least in the beginning. And we can also, using simulation software, mock up a catalog that would match a similar image survey, so we can actually check, like, are the distributions, what is our efficiency? So you get better at finding objects when they have high signal to noise. That part is not hard to understand. You also get, it's harder to find objects at high redshift, but there are more of them, and so you need to balance like a number of objects versus quality of objects. And so as you make your sample, otherwise you end up with a lot of junk, particularly, there's no classification here. Now we're just assuming again that we've got all 1As, for example. So the good news is we do an okay job at recovering some of the parameters. Okay, I mean, I showed you millimagnitudes before, so we're now an order of magnitude larger than that, because we have not that many supernovae, but at least the residuals have no particular shape, which is great. So this is just a proof of concept, and the next months we'll be trying to increase the size of these simulations, and then also just start to run this pipeline end to end. It's quite computationally intensive, and so figuring out how to juice our computers and our algorithms to really make use of, compress the time is also a huge challenge for all of us. And I think it's easy to think of, the end stage MCMC analysis, and to forget that there's this whole wealth of stuff we need to do and check first. Okay, so what's next? We're going to analyze, work with brokers, figure out how to do everything more efficiently, do images to cosmology analysis, get ready for real data, and then just lie weeping, ready to go, so that we can complete this full cycle. But for the last little bit of my talk, I wanted to this very interdisciplinary and engaged audience, give you a little flavor for how this kind of analysis might actually translate outside of your wheelhouse. So a full disclaimer, the last time I took a formal biology course was 9th grade. So we're all learning together. But I was giving a talk about astronomy, machine learning, cosmology to a wide audience, and a colleague of mine from the University of Laval in Canada came up, and she was like, "Oh my God, the cosmic web, it looks like brains." And I was like, "That's true." We didn't go into why that is. That's not necessarily the purpose of this talk, but it just meant that we sat down and said, what do you do in your analysis, and what do I do in my analysis, and is there any way we could collaborate? And it's turned out to be this super fun joint project with a bunch of students that I'm going to tell you about super briefly. Okay, so what do they do how do they use machine learning for neuroscience? Well, they typically also do detection, and I'll explain to you where that comes from. They also do object segmentation, so they want to find out the boundaries of things, particularly if they're looking at kind of protein structures, because the size and the shape can tell you something about neurodegenerative diseases. So a lot of my colleagues that work in this field are studying Parkinson's and ALS. They also do anomaly detection. So if you're interested in studying this stuff, you want to tell the difference between that and that, or that, which is the edge of your image, right? Okay, so, you have, when we talk about synaptic activity, so the synapse is here, and all of your electrical activity in your brain is mediated by the release of calcium. I did not know this 2 years ago, and it's bananas. So there's just calcium, it's called calcium-induced calcium release, calcium just like zipping around in your brain. And so these calcium transients, they call them calcium transients, they happen because of this kind of release of proteins in the synapses. And you can either have synaptic transients that are happening around in this gap, or you can have an excited dendrite, so the sticky bit, the holy bit or the sticky bit. If you have calcium-induced calcium release on the dendrite, the whole dendrite like flourishes and is much brighter transient. Both are interesting and both tell you something about activity. So calcium is released when electrical signals happen in your brain. So what? So this is why biology is so cool. So what they do is they're like, we'll inject a dye that's sensitive to calcium. So this is what they do. So this is, it's high resolution microscopy. So they take hippocampal cells from mice. I'll tell you a story in a second about just how little I know about biology. So they inject this dye that is sensitive to calcium that flashes. So it literally flashes when there's calcium. And so you see these tiny calcium transients that happen, and I'll show some movies. And why do you do that? Well, it turns out there are a couple of things if you want to study the way brains work. Turns out this is a sort of a synaptic map, so like a 3D registering of where these flashes are happening and the structure of them. You can actually not only study where they come from, but within a certain region, you can actually see different responses depending on what activity is happening. Now, just as an aside, as someone who did not know anything about neuroscience research, I assumed almost all studies were done in vitro, so in a dish. Turns out you can safely put a window, a little glass window in a brain of a mouse, and they will run around for weeks. You could actually do it in a human too. You can put a hole in your skull and cover it with glass, and you like wouldn't notice. I mean, you would notice, but not like in that way. And so you can also do in vivo work. And spoiler alert, foreshadowing, some of the analysis that we're doing is so fast that we're now going to look at doing it in vivo rather than just in vitro. But all the stuff I've done is in vitro. Okay, one other side point. So when I was looking at graphs of the data, I said to one of the students, I was like, oh, it's interesting, can you not take your observations for longer because the observations only go to a certain number of days? And he was like, well, no, because the mouse dies. And I realized that's the difference between astronomy and not astronomy. And I also said, and I apologize for how stupid this is, I said, how do you find mice that have Parkinson's disease? But they don't, they give them Parkinson's disease. So there are some, you have to like deal with some things. But part of this is, of course, to study the progression, because the point of this research is that if you do have a neurodegenerative disease, these signatures show up way before macroscopic symptoms. And so the path of all of this work is eventually developing ways where you can treat the disease before you have macroscopic symptoms, which is much more damaging. So that's the context of this work. Okay, so what do? They take these, so this is kind of nanoscale microscopy, high resolution microscopy. They take a bunch of these images and they do a threshold-based analysis. They find bright things according to a threshold. They get a bunch of these, and they already have a very advanced machine learning approach. Initially, I kind of had a bit of a swagger, and I thought, we can show you all the things we do in ML. They're like, no, it's fine. We've got a lot of ML already. But we realized that the places we could offer some insight is in this early step, in the image analysis, because they were basically just doing simple thresholding. And the reason why this is a problem is because, one neuron is giving you 6,000 frames, upwards of a few thousand calcium transient events. And this is, tiny, tiny pieces, spatial resolution. And, it takes a long time to computationally, but also this manual event inspection, it's called grad student, right? Or professor, like there's just hidden in that. It's actually the time for the students. So the students were hand annotating where all the transients were and then training a machine learning algorithm. And we thought, could we do better? And the best thing you can do is look at the wonderful work that your colleagues have done. So, people find sticky things in the sky all the time. I love this plot. I try to use it whenever I can. And so Susan Clark and collaborators, of course, use the rolling half transform to find spindly things in distributions. And so we said, well, let's apply the rolling half transform to these images so that we can get a better map of the dendrite. Because the problem was where they weren't modeling the dendrite at all, they were just doing a threshold, which is kind of prone to a lot of issues, especially if you have issues with focus of the telescope, or the microscope, which happens a lot. I should say this work is done by my amazing student, Bolin Fan, who is doing this for sort of a third of his PhD, and the rest is astronomy based. But okay, so we do the rolling half and we find we have a good dendritic mask. We then use the dendritic mask to do a better job at averaging, coming up with the average dendrite for the image, and then you can do a better difference image. The other thing they were doing, unlike the sky, is that there's much more variation of the background with each frame. It's not like you have a template image that you can stack. It's always changing every image. But you can do an inverse variance weighting to do a better job of that background of averaging. And so our image subtraction got better, and our ability to see transients improved. And then we said, okay, so we'll just use like dB scan and actually find and pull these transients out. So basically you're saying how many little pixels make, or voxels make a cluster, and you can do those voxels in space and in time. And then you can say, how many am I allowed? What is the distance between them? What is my brightness threshold? And you can do this. We actually tried a bunch of different astronomy approaches, like floodful and others, to see what is the best way to find these transients. And in terms of both accuracy, but also speed, this worked really well. And we found that it's not super dependent on the parameters that you choose about the brightness or the number of points in your cluster. Okay, so what do we do? So we called it AstroBeats because, again, acronyms, well, this is not an acronym, this is just a name. But one of the things that we're finding is that we're already outperforming both the hand annotated model, you know, on data where they have done hand annotations, and the the model that was trained on segmentation. So we're doing better in terms of precision and recall for both of these models. So these are about 10 across 10 videos. We're also finding a few interesting things. So AstroBeats does well at finding bigger dendritic transients, and also so it misses some of the super tiny ones, but we're also finding that we do a little bit better at understanding the transients that we find and characterizing them. So now we can start asking questions like, we can, with AstroBeats and our parameters, we can start separating out populations where there were true transients versus the telescope focus, microscope focus changing, which are sort of false transients. So we can now do a better job at cleaning out the junk before doing any kind of training. We also are able to look at the types of transients. I was particularly interested in this because I just told you about optical transients. And so I thought, ooh, can we fit a model to the transients and learn something new? Turns out there's this amazing thing called the diffusion coefficient. I don't know if you've heard about it, but you can basically model our light curves by the time it takes calcium to diffuse in a medium. So we didn't learn anything particularly novel other than it works, diffusion works. But these are interesting because some of the out of focus ones you can think about analyzing in a different way, and more importantly, starting to see as you build up the sample, is there anything different between the synaptic and the dendritic transients? And I don't mean to throw them under the bus too much, but we also are helping to retrain the humans. So my colleagues, each of the manual inspections was done by 2 people. One of the other students in the group is actually using some of our techniques to start to look at, like, you know, galaxy zoo type comparison, like where are they disagreeing, how they are actually averaging. And what we did is we went to all the ones we were pretty sure were real transients that had been missed by the experts, and got them to look at them again. And almost all of the ones that we found, they realized they probably should have classified as correct transients, but they disagreed. And so now we can start to actually build a more robust model of how we do this training for future ML applications. So this is super fun work, and it happened, you know, there's nothing new in any of the stuff I've been telling you about. These are well-tested astronomy methods applied in a range of ways. And as we go forward, we're starting to think of other things that we can do that haven't been done in the space. Like, nobody takes a power spectrum of these images. Nobody really looks at stacking of neurons, because they all see these as individual special neurons. And the interesting thing is that people also don't compare data from different microscopes, even though they're the same model and are used in the same configurations, because there really there aren't ways to compare performance and to share data. So people will give someone their whole data set, but no one's combining their data to start asking different questions across larger data sets. Finally, one of the things we're looking at is, you can inject different kinds of dyes depending on what you care about. And what we're now doing is looking at, image deblenders that are so useful in astronomy and saying, can we apply these in a biological context using some model of what we think these protein structures, say, would look like, as opposed to calcium transients. You can actually think about the structure of objects and innovating in that space. So with simple techniques, we're able to make some progression in this space. And it's really opened me up to thinking about what are the tools that we use or that we take for granted that we just don't think of as applicable in other fields. And what might we learn in both ways if we start to just ask questions of each other and see where things go. So, the next steps are synthetic source injection. So doing better simulations. Turns out biologists don't do simulations in this space because they're super complicated. And so we want to try and do this. We're also starting to look at in vivo applications because we're going pretty fast, or we're able to do these classifications pretty fast. And then doing things like anomaly detection to understand, can we start to detect anomalous either firings or functional distribution of these transients in diseased mice. So I will pause here. It's really, really fun. And I hope all of you have examples of similar things. And if not, if you can ask me questions. So thanks.
Thank you, Renee. Any questions from the audience here?
Sure. So when you do like segmentations for these things, I was just wondering, like, can you do it in 3D? Because like when I feel like I've seen examples of people doing segmentation when the topology is closed, but if you allow it to like maybe not have, if it's more complicated or just a general 3D object, like just curious like how you can handle something like that.
Yeah, they try. So that's a good question. I think understanding the structure more is useful. They typically, I didn't really talk too much about the actual segmentation of protein structures. So by the way, we also made a Galaxy Zoo challenge called Synaptic Protein Zoo, which was fun. But so the problem is they're trying to get, so they have these lasers that they use to excite the medium. So there's it's hilarious. It's 2 photons. I've never thought of 2 photons before, but anyway, it's 2 photon excitation. And they actually, the depth that they can go on, and therefore the 3D structure is a function of the laser power. And it can't always go very far. And also you don't want it to go too far because then there's a lot of confusion because you're just exciting everything. So what they sometimes then do is try to do like narrow but different filters. So there's some structure, but it's hard to actually associate it with a 3D shape. But maybe we can think more about that. Yeah.
So you mentioned going all the way back to plastic elastic. You mentioned that data augmentation was critical. And it looked to me from just looking at the table that the reason people are putting in the data augmentation is to do things like handle the fact that the data might be fainter and there might be more noise, or you might be missing data points, or you might be higher redshift and so on. And isn't that a little bit kind of condemning of these machine learning methods, because it's saying that we have to convince the machine learning methods to do the right thing with the data by doing these degradation of things. Whereas if we had a model that we really had a kind of likelihood or a generative or a forward kind of model, it would capture those things. So can you just say a few things about like machine learning versus kind of traditional model fitting things, and what's the future? Is it really going to be data augmentation and brute force?
No, I think that's a good point. And yeah, I feel like it's a sort of tricky question because, of course, if you have a model for how to degrade data, okay, throwing data points away is maybe trivial, but if you're doing something like redshifting or have a real model for the error bars, then you could answer, well, say, well, then I have a model, so then do it forward. And I think there is a lot of power to that for sure. you know, I would say that a lot of this challenge at least seemed to be a very interesting first thing you could do, that I don't think any particularly, there wasn't that much particularly sophisticated principled stuff. I think the data set has been used since then by people who are actually doing much more of a forward modeling problem, but I think people did the sort of easiest, earliest thing you can do. I would say one issue is that there isn't, well, maybe this is a too strong a statement, but there isn't that much. It would be great if people could share their models across different types of objects, because most people build models for the things they care about. And so we found this even when we were trying to simulate them, right? Whereas I think if we don't do a good job with all the models, then you're just going to be limited by your worst model in terms of if you are really doing things forward modeled. And so it would be, I think unless we do a better job at sort of agreeing how much that model dependence will change things, then this is what people will default to.
You triggered me on one other thing there, which I think is just a comment now. It's very interesting that in these kinds of problems, you often have to spend most of your time on the objects you don't care about.
Exactly.
And I think a lot of people are going to really feel that when the first alerts start coming out.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because sometimes with people, the galactic versus extragalactic folks, they're just like, you know, this didn't use any of that information, so it didn't use like distance to host or anything like that. And people, there was a debate like, do we want postage stamps? Do we not want postage stamps? And people said, I don't need them for my analysis. And you're like, the whole point is your analysis is going to be in among all the other stuff. And so I totally agree. You need to think about the thing that's you don't understand the most, not the thing you care about the most. And that's just a whole sea change in what people have done. Yeah.
So speaking of things that you don't care about, what about man-made transients, satellites, etc.? How will you deal with that then?
That's great. So actually there's some really very awesome and very scary work that has been done by folks. Actually, Željko Ivicic has done some work on this, on like predicting how many transients we see, and Samantha Lawler, I think is how you guys pronounce her name, also has done work on just seeing how many of these you'd get. So most of the man-made signals or asteroids will be already detected by the difference image analysis pipeline. So they probably won't make it into here. That doesn't mean we should probably think about including them. But I think so that I should say that this work is sort of assuming we're working within the Rubin alert stream, but we're not. We're sort of assuming that they have done that first cleaning of alerts because they're going to be publishing them after some initial cleaning. So we didn't add extra transients, but you would sort of see, because they're moving, that means it's easier to detect that. And so we think that the difference image pipeline from the Rubin project will get rid of those. But I just told you to worry about the things you don't know. So yeah. But I should say, if you want to be very scared, go and look up satellite constellation like Rubin or whatever, and you'll see some images that Sam has of just, or some movies of just like a bee's nest, which I didn't appreciate. And the thing that to me is actually more scary is the probability of collision, which is not related to Rubin, but it's huge. Like, it's really surprising that there isn't more stuff just exploding. It's really quite scary as the density of things gets increased. So.
All right, if there's no more questions, 2 reminders. One, I think on November 15th, it's International Renée Day.
True.
So Renée wants everyone to know about her birthday.
Have a beer on my birthday. Not for me, have it for yourself, but
I forgot to
send me
say.
the bill.
And second reminder is that there's food and wine and other drinks, I think, outside. So let's go do that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.